Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we uncover the terrifying story of Richard Ramirez, the infamous Night Stalker who turned an entire city into a nightmare. During the summer of 1985, fear gripped Los Angeles as a mysterious killer struck without warning. Men, women, and even children lived in constant terror, never knowing where he would strike next. How did an ordinary young man become one of America's most feared serial killers? And how was he finally caught? Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon for more true crime documentaries. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The City of Angels in Darkness. Los Angeles, California. The summer of 1985. Ana winds pushed through the canyons and curled down into the flatlands of the San Gabriel Valley, carrying with them the scent of dry brush and eucalyptus. It was a city that had always traded in fantasy, in sunlight and movie magic, in the sunlight and movie magic promise of reinvention. But in those sweltering months, something dark had taken up residence in the shadows between streetlights, something that moved through the night with terrible purpose, leaving behind a trail of blood and terror that no one, not the police, not the press, not the people who lived with their windows open and their back doors unlocked, could quite believe was real. The City of Angels was being hunted. News reports spoke of a killer who struck without pattern, without apparent motive, without mercy. He moved from neighborhood to neighborhood, crossing county lines, attacking in Monterey Park, then Arcadia, then Sierra Madre, then Sun Valley, then Mission Hills. No one knew who he was. No one knew who he was, could predict where he might appear next. But the city felt him. People began locking their doors and windows despite the summer heat. Hardware stores reported a surge in deadbolt sales. Gun shops saw lines stretching out onto the sidewalk. Parents warned their children. Grandparents who had lived through war said they had never felt fear quite like this. And somewhere in that beautiful, sprawling, complicated city, a man with rotting teeth and sunken eyes was sleeping through the day and walking through the dark of night like something that had crawled out of a nightmare. His name, though no one knew it yet, was Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez. The newspapers would eventually call him the Night Stalker. And by the time Los Angeles finally knew his face, he had already written himself into history as one of the most savage and prolific serial killers the United States had ever seen. This is his story. It is not a story of glory or romance. It is a story of glory, violence, of suffering, of broken lives and shattered families, of a city gripped by fear. It is also a story about how evil is made, not born whole from some supernatural darkness, but assembled, piece by terrible piece, from the raw material of a damaged human life. A culture of violence, an obsession that was allowed to grow unchecked until it consumed everything. To understand Richard Ramirez, we must go back to the beginning. We must go back to El Paso, Texas, to a house on the edge of the border, to a family shaped by hard labor and harder times, to a boy who was there when the darkness first arrived. Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, the last of 5 children born to Mercedes and Julian Ramirez in El Paso, Texas. The leap year birthday was the first strange fact of his existence, a birthday that came only once every 4 years, as if the calendar itself was uncertain what to make of him. El Paso sat at the far western tip of Texas, pressed against the Rio Grande and the Mexican city of Juarez, on the other side of the water. It was a border city in every sense, a place caught between 2 languages, 2 cultures, 2 economic worlds. Julian Ramirez had crossed that border legally from Chihuahua, Mexico, seeking work, and found it on the railroad, doing the backbreaking labor that built and maintained the country's infrastructure. It was honest work, but it was brutal work, and it left its brutal mark on a man. Julian was known to be a strict and sometimes violent father. Reports from neighbors and family members who would later speak to investigators described a man who kept tight control over his household, who did not spare the rod. The children learned early that transgression brought pain. This was not uncommon in working-class households of that era and that region. Corporal punishment was normalized, expected, woven into the fabric of how families functioned. But the line between discipline and abuse was frequently crossed in the Ramirez home, and the psychological toll on the children, including young Ricardo, was real and lasting. Mercedes Ramirez was by most accounts a gentle woman, worn down by the counts, a gentle woman. Demands of raising 5 children. While her husband worked long hours on the railroad, she was devoted to her family, to her faith, to the rhythms of a life organized around work and church and neighborhood. She loved her children, including her children, youngest. But she was also, in many ways, powerless, a woman of her time and place, operating within structures that gave her little agency in the face of her husband's dominance. Ricardo grew up in a small house in a working-class neighborhood, surrounded by siblings. His brothers Reuben, Robert, and Joseph, and his sister Rosa. The household was crowded, money was tight, and the emotional atmosphere was shaped by fear of the father's temper. By many accounts, Ricardo was a quiet child in his early years, somewhat withdrawn, given to keeping to himself. He was not the kind of boy who naturally drew attention. That would change. The first true turning point in Ricardo Ramirez's life came not from his father, but from his cousin. Miguel Ramirez, known to the family as Mike, was a Green Beret who had served multiple tours in Vietnam. He was, by the time Ricardo came to know him well, a man carrying enormous psychological weight. Vietnam had done to Mike Ramirez what it did to thousands of young men who were sent into that particular hell. It had shattered something inside him and left the pieces in disorder. He suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the early 1970s there was no name for it, no treatment offered, no support structure in place. Veterans came home, and the country largely looked away from what they had seen and done. Mike Ramirez did not look away. He revisited it constantly, and he brought Ricardo with him on those revisitations. From an early age, some accounts suggest Ricardo was as young as 10 or 11. Mike began showing his young cousin photographs from his time in Vietnam. These were not photographs of landscapes or of soldiers smiling in the sun. These were photographs of violence, of dead bodies, of mutilated corpses, of the aftermath of combat, and allegedly of atrocities that went beyond the bounds of war. Mike spoke of killing with what Mrs. later described as a mixture of pride and relish. He spoke of what it felt like to end a life. He showed the photographs as if they were souvenirs of adventure. Ricardo was captivated. This is the moment that many criminologists and psychologists who have studied the Ramirez case point to as the origin point, the place where something in the child's developing mind began to bend in a dangerous direction. Not because Mike Ramirez was the sole cause of what his cousin became, but because those sessions represented a perfect storm. A boy already made anxious and volatile by a violent home environment, now being given a detailed education in violence by an authority figure he idolized, in a context where violence was framed as power, as masculinity, as something to be admired rather than feared. Ricardo began to model himself on his cousin. He wanted to be like Mike, strong, dangerous, capable of things that ordinary people could not. Though, in the distorted logic of a child absorbing lessons he was never equipped to handle, violence became associated not with shame or horror, but with status. And then one afternoon, something happened that would mark Ricardo Ramirez forever. In 1973, when Ricardo was 13 years old, he was present in a room when Miguel Ramirez shot and killed his wife, Jessie. During an argument, he shot her in the face. Ricardo witnessed the murder. He was 13 years old, standing in a room, watching his cousin's wife die. The legal consequences for Mike were minimal. He was found not guilty by reason of temporary insanity and was institutionalized briefly before being released. The psychological consequences for young Ricardo were incalculable. He had now not only been shown photographs of death and violence and taught to admire it, He had seen it happen. He had seen a woman's life end in an instant, and the man who had done it faced almost no consequences. What does a 13-year-old make of that? What lesson does he absorb? In Ricardo Ramirez's case, it appears he absorbed the lesson that violence was something men did, that it carried power, and that the world would not necessarily punish you for it. In the years that followed, Ricardo drifted further from the gravitational pull of ordinary adolescence. He began smoking marijuana regularly in his early teens, then moved on to harder substances. He began spending less time at home and more time in the streets, in the company of older boys and men who existed on the margins of the law. He developed a talent for petty theft, for slipping through spaces he wasn't supposed to occupy, for taking things that didn't belong to him. He also began attending school with decreasing regularity. When he did attend, he was described by teachers as disengaged, difficult to reach, prone to staring out windows or into space. Whatever intellectual capacity he possessed, and later assessments would suggest he was of at least average intelligence, was going untended, running to seed in the dry soil of neglect and trauma and substance abuse. Around this time, Ricardo suffered another significant physical event. In an accident that would have long-term neurological consequences, he was involved in two separate incidents of head trauma. One in a car accident, another when a swing hit him in the head as a child. Some researchers have pointed to these head injuries as potential contributing factors to his later behavior, noting the well-documented links between traumatic brain injury and impulse control problems, between frontal lobe damage and the capacity for empathy. These are not excuses, but they are data points, pieces of the mosaic that compose Richard Ramirez. By his mid-teens, Ricardo Ramirez had developed another consuming interest that would follow him into adulthood. Satanism. It began, as it did for many teenagers of that era, somewhat casually, with the music of heavy metal bands whose imagery played with darkness and the occult, with the aesthetic of rebellion and transgression. But for Ricardo, it deepened into something more serious, more personal, more ideological. He became genuinely invested in the idea of Satan as a figure of power, of someone who had refused submission, who had chosen freedom from divine authority at the cost of everything else. In the satanic figure, Ricardo apparently saw something he wanted to emulate. Total rejection of the moral framework that the society imposed. He began to identify himself, privately and then eventually publicly, as a Satanist. He wore pentagrams. He drew them on walls. He would eventually, in his adult criminal career, leave them at crime scenes as a kind of crime scene signature, or, in his mind, as a tribute. By the time he reached his late teens and dropped out of school entirely, Ricardo Ramirez had assembled within himself a volatile combination: childhood trauma, exposure to graphic violence, substance abuse, a philosophy that actively celebrated transgression, and a deep, festering anger at a world that had never quite given him the stability or love or guidance he needed. He was not yet a killer, but he was becoming one. Chapter 2. Road to California. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Ricardo Ramirez began the gradual migration westward that would eventually deposit him in Los Angeles, a city that, for all its glamour and mythology, was also a place where a drifter could go disappear, where a young man with no fixed address could move through neighborhoods without drawing much attention, where the vastness and anonymity of the sprawl provided cover for whatever he chose to do in the dark. He passed through time in El Paso, through brief stays in other Texas cities, through encounters with the law that accumulated like a slow-building file. His criminal record in his teens and early 20s consisted primarily of drug possession and petty theft, the kind of offenses that the justice system processed with minimal fanfare, doling out fines and short jail stays that did nothing to interrupt the trajectory he was on. He worked, when he worked at all, in ways that required little commitment. day labor, casual jobs, nothing that required him to stay in one place, to be accountable to someone, to participate in the ordinary structures of adult life. He was, by every account from people who encountered him in those years, a man who existed on the periphery, who subsisted on very little, who needed almost nothing in terms of material comfort. He could sleep almost anywhere, in abandoned buildings, in parks, in the cars of acquaintances, under bridges. He ate irregularly. He used drugs with the consistency he could not apply to anything else in his life. One habit that stood out among those who crossed his path during this period was his consumption of junk food, specifically candy, sweets, sugary drinks. He was almost entirely dependent on convenience store food, on snacks eaten in gas station parking lots, on the cheapest and most sugar-dense calories available. His dental hygiene was catastrophically poor. By the time he became notorious, his teeth were badly decayed, blackened, and rotting in ways that caused people who encountered him in person to recoil. This was not incidental detail. His teeth became one of the distinguishing physical features that would eventually help authorities identify him. It was also, in a grim way, symbolic. Here was a man who had neglected every normal structure of self-maintenance, who had let his own body decay as he let everything else in his life decay, who existed entirely in the present moment with no regard for consequences, for future, for the normal calculus by which most human beings organize their days. He arrived in Los Angeles sometime around 1980, and the city absorbed him without notice. He drifted through downtown, through Skid Row, through the neighborhoods of East LA, and then further west and north as circumstance directed. He frequented the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, a place with a long and troubled history, a cheap residential hotel that housed drifters and the mentally ill and those who had fallen through every available crack in the social safety net. The Cecil was the kind of place where no one asked questions, where a man could come and go at odd hours without drawing comment, where the transient population was dense enough that any one individual could remain invisible. In Los Angeles, Ricardo Ramirez's criminal career continued to expand. He was arrested multiple times for auto theft, for drug possession, for driving without a license. Each time, he passed through the system and emerged again, unchanged, untroubled by whatever minimal consequences were applied to him. The system encountered him and failed to hold him, failed to recognize what was accumulating inside him, failed to intervene in any meaningful way. This is not entirely surprising. The criminal justice system of that era was not equipped to look at a young man with a history of petty crimes and predict the catastrophic crimes, violence that was still years away from manifesting. But it is worth noting, because it speaks to a broader failure. The failure to see, to engage, to interrupt a trajectory before it reached its terminal destination. In the years before his killing spree began in earnest, Richard Ramirez, he had by now largely abandoned his given first name Ricardo, preferring the anglicized Richard, was developing in several significant ways. His commitment to Satanism deepened and became more explicit. He was drawn to bands like AC, whose song Night Prowler, a menacing track about someone who moves through the night unseen and unwanted, became something of an anthem for him. He would later claim to investigators, and eventually in court, that the song spoke to him personally, that he identified with the lurking predatory figure. The song described, he wore a baseball cap with the band's logo. He played their music when he could. He internalized the imagery. He was, also by this point, experimenting with sexual violence before his full murder spree began. There are accounts of assaults, of a young woman in a hotel whom he attacked and attempted to rape, a crime for which he was briefly held, but ultimately not prosecuted in a way that stopped him. The pattern of escalation, so well documented in the criminological literature on serial offenders, was already underway. The internal threshold for violence was being lowered, recalibrated, reset at a new and terrible normal. And he was, by all accounts, increasingly consumed by a dark fantasy life, by visions of violence and domination, by a worldview in which other human beings were objects, in which his own desires and his satanic ideology were the only values that mattered. He had constructed, inside his own mind, a complete alternative moral universe in which he was not bound by the laws or norms or ethics that governed ordinary life. He was, in his own conception of himself, beyond those things. This is, criminologists tell us, a common feature of the psychology of serial killers who operate on the scale that Ramirez would eventually achieve. The ability to dehumanize victims, to see them not as people with interiority and relationships and value, but as objects to be used, is not something that arrives fully formed. It is built, slowly, through a combination of native temperament, early trauma, fantasy, rehearsal, and gradual erosion of whatever inhibitory mechanisms a person carries against committing violence. By the time Richard Ramirez picked up a weapon and entered a stranger's home with intent to harm, that long construction project was complete. He was ready, though ready is perhaps too clean a word for the chaotic, drug-addled, ideologically warped state he inhabited. He was primed. The exact date on which Richard Ramirez committed his first murder is a matter of some debate, as it often is with serial killers whose early crimes may not have been immediately attributed to them. What is generally accepted is that his killing career began in 1984. Though some investigators believe there may have been earlier crimes that were never definitively linked to him. In June of 1984, a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vincow was murdered in her apartment in the Glassell Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. She was found by her son the following morning. She had been stabbed repeatedly, her throat cut so severely that she was nearly decapitated. She had also been sexually assaulted. The apartment showed signs of burglary. Ramirez had entered through a window screen he removed from the outside. Jenny Vincow was a widow, living alone, an elderly woman who had every reason to expect that she would spend a quiet summer night in her own apartment, undisturbed. Instead, she became the first confirmed victim of Richard Ramirez. She is worth naming, worth pausing over, because in the telling of a story like this, there is always the danger of the killer's narrative consuming everything, of the murderer's psychology and crimes becoming the focus, while the people he destroyed recede into the focus, background becoming mere data points in someone else's story. That is a failure that should be resisted. Jenny Vincow was a person. She had a life before that night. She had a son who loved her. She deserved to grow old in peace. After the murder of Vincow, Ramirez was not arrested. No suspect was identified. He moved through Los Angeles unmolested, sustained by drugs and candy bars and whatever he managed to steal, waiting, though he may not have experienced it as waiting, for something to happen again. It would. The pace would accelerate, and the summer of 1985 would write his name in the darkest pages of Los Angeles history. Chapter 3. The Summer of Terror. The year 1985 was, by most measures, a good one for Los Angeles. The city had successfully hosted the 1984 Summer Olympics and was still riding a wave of civic pride and international attention. The economy was relatively robust. The real estate market was climbing. New restaurants and boutiques were opening in neighborhoods that were being transformed by gentrification. The entertainment industry was booming. Ronald Reagan, a man deeply associated with the Southern California ethos of optimism and can-do energy, was in the White House, and then March arrived, and with it, Richard Ramirez. On March 17, 1985, Ramirez attacked Maria Hernandez in the garage of her home in Rosemead, a suburb in the San Gabriel Valley. He shot her in the face with a .22 caliber handgun. Bye-bye. Extraordinary fortune. The bullet struck a set of keys she was holding, which deflected it just enough to prevent it from entering her skull directly, and she survived, falling to the ground and playing dead as Ramirez stepped over her and entered her condominium. Inside, he found her roommate, Dale Okazaki, a 34-year-old woman who worked at the Los Angeles Airport Marriott. He shot her in the head. She died immediately. Ramirez returned outside, stepped over Maria Hernandez again. She was still lying on the ground, still feigning death, in a state of desperate, motionless terror, and left. That same night, within an hour of the attack in Rosemead, Ramirez struck again. He stopped a car on a street in Monterey Park, pulled out the driver, Tsai Lian-yu, a 30-year-old woman, and shot her. She died from her wounds 2 days later. 2 attacks in a single night. 2 locations. 3 victims. 2 dead. 1 survivor by the grace of chance. Alone. The Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department now had something on their hands that they could not immediately categorize. Multiple murders, multiple jurisdictions, no obvious connection between victims, no clear motive beyond robbery and violence. The investigation was fragmented, as it tends to be in a metropolitan area as vast and jurisdictionally complex as Greater Los Angeles, where dozens of separate law enforcement agencies operate with varying degrees of communication and coordination. The killer, meanwhile, was not waiting. On March 27, 1985, 10 days after the Rosemead and Monterey Park attacks, Richard Ramirez invaded the home of Vincent and Maxine Zazzara in Whittier. He shot Vincent Zazzara, who was 54 years old, in the head while he slept. He then entered the bedroom where Maxine Zazzara, 44 years old, was sleeping and woke her before shooting her. But he did not stop there. In an act of savagery that went beyond even the murders he had already committed, he mutilated Maxine Zazzara's body, gouging out her eyes. He also ransacked the house, taking valuables. The Los Angeles Times would later describe the Zazzara murders as the moment when investigators truly began to understand that they were dealing with something different. Not an ordinary killer, not a robber who had escalated, but something far more dangerous and far more difficult to predict. The level of violence, the apparent pleasure the killer had taken in going beyond mere murder into mutilation, suggested a depth of pathology that was alarming to the most seasoned detectives. And still the attacks continued. In May of 1985, Ramirez, 1985, attacked Harold and John Wu in their home in Monrovia. Harold Wu, 66 years old, was shot in the head. John Wu, 63, was beaten and raped. She survived, but was left with severe injuries. In May, he attacked Malviel Keller and her sister Blanche Wolfe in their home in Burbank. Both elderly women were beaten. Blanche Wolfe died. Malviel Keller survived. In June, he attacked Ruth Wilson, 41 years old, in her home in Burbank. He tied her up, raped her, sodomized her, and stole her valuables before leaving. The murders and attacks were accelerating. The geographic range was expanding. And still, no one had a name, no one had a face, no one had a suspect. The 2 major law enforcement agencies with jurisdiction over the crimes, the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department, were struggling to communicate effectively, to pool resources, to understand that the same person was responsible for what looked like a scattered series of violent incidents rather than a coordinated campaign. This is one of the most troubling dimensions of the Ramirez case from an institutional perspective. Serial killers who range across jurisdictions are, by their nature, difficult to catch, precisely because they exploit the seams in law enforcement's organizational structure. Each attack falls into someone's jurisdiction, someone's filing cabinet, someone's caseload. But the pattern that might reveal a single perpetrator is harder to see when you're looking at individual files rather than at the whole. It took months for investigators to begin connecting the dots with confidence. And in those months, Richard Ramirez kept moving. The summer of 1985 was when the Night Stalker terror reached its peak intensity. On July 2nd, Mary Louise II was killed in her home in Arcadia. She was 75 years old. On July 5th, Whitney Bennett, 16 years old, was bludgeoned with a tire iron in her home in Sierra Madre. She survived, in part because the tire iron shorted out on an electrical wire during the attack. Her survival was nothing less than miraculous. On July 7th, Joyce Lucille Nelson, 61 years old, was beaten to death in her home in Monterey Park. On July 20th, Maxon and Leila Knighting were shot in their beds in Glendale. Maxon was 66. Leila was 64. They were killed within moments of each other, unable to help or protect one another. On the same night, Ramirez drove to Sun Valley and attacked Chainarong Covenant, 32, shooting him in the head while he slept. He then woke Chainarong's wife, Somkid, and raped her while forcing her to swear to Satan. He also molested their 8-year-old son. The crimes were now front-page news. The Los Angeles Times, the Herald Examiner, and television stations were covering the murders extensively, feeding the city's rising panic. Tips flooded into police. Neighborhood watch groups formed overnight. People who had never owned guns were going to gun stores. The Cecil Hotel, where Ramirez was known to stay, was mentioned in some coverage, but no one had yet been able to identify the man who walked through its doors, with rotting teeth and eyes that, by all accounts from those who encountered him, seemed to look at the world with a cold and unnerving vacancy. On August 6th, Christopher and Virginia Peterson were attacked in their home in Northridge. Christopher was shot in the face but survived. Virginia was shot in the head but also survived. An outcome that left investigators puzzled. Ramirez was usually thorough in his lethality, and the survival of both victims in this attack was anomalous. On August 8th, Ahmed Zia and his wife Suki were attacked in their home in Diamond Bar. Ahmed was shot. Suki was raped. And on August 17th, a night that would later be described by investigators as among the most disturbing of the entire summer, Ramirez attacked the home of Peter and Barbara Pan in Lake Merced, in San Francisco. He shot Peter Pan in the head, killing him instantly. He beat and raped Barbara Pan, shooting her in the head as well. She survived, though she was left with catastrophic injuries. On the bedroom wall, Ramirez drew a pentagram in lipstick and left a note declaring his allegiance to Satan. The Night Stalker had now crossed county lines. He had now struck in San Francisco. Struck in San Francisco. Terror, which had felt like a Los Angeles problem, had become something else entirely, had become a statewide emergency. Chapter 4. The hunt? The pressure on California law enforcement was immense. The public was terrified. Politicians were calling for answers. Chief Daryl Gates of the LAPD was facing withering criticism over the department's failure to stop the killer. The FBI had been brought in. The California Department of Justice was coordinating. Task forces had been assembled, and yet the killer's identity remained a mystery. What investigators did have, by the summer of 1985, was a growing body of forensic evidence from the various crime scenes. They had collected bullets, all consistent with a .22 caliber weapon in many cases, though Ramirez also used other firearms as well as knives and blunt instruments. They had a rough physical description from survivors. A tall, thin Hispanic man with dark, unkempt hair, distinctively bad teeth, and eyes that several survivors described as dark and penetrating. They had the pentagram imagery, which spoke to a satanic motivation, or at least aesthetic. They had a behavioral profile from the FBI that painted a picture of a disorganized killer, someone who planned his crimes in broad terms, but operated with significant improvisation, who was driven by both the desire for material gain through robbery and by a need for violence and domination that transcended the merely material. What they all did not have was a name, The break came through the meticulous work of forensic science, specifically through a fingerprint. On August 24, 1985, Ramirez attacked Bill Carnes and Inez Erickson in their condominium in Mission Viejo, in Orange County. He shot Bill Carnes, 29 years old, 3 times in the head. Carnes survived, though with severe brain damage that would leave him permanently disabled. He then raped and sodomized Inez Erickson, 29, making her swear to Satan. Before leaving, he tied her up and stole her car, a distinctive orange Toyota. This was, in retrospect, a critical mistake. Inez Erickson freed herself after Ramirez left, went to a neighbor's house, and called the police. A young boy in the neighborhood had noticed the strange man and the orange Toyota and, with the alertness of childhood that sometimes cuts through adult preoccupation, had written down the license plate number. The license plate led police to the stolen Toyota, and from the Toyota, they recovered a fingerprint. The fingerprint was run through the automated fingerprint identification system that California had only recently installed, a technological development that proved to be crucial. The print came back with a match. Ricardo Leiva Ramirez, born February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, a man with a criminal record, a man who had passed through the system multiple times, who had been arrested, who was in the database. He had a pronoun. On August 30, 1985, the Los Angeles Times and other major news outlets published the photograph of Richard Ramirez, his booking photo from a previous arrest, showing that dark-eyed face, those rotting teeth, that unsettling gaze. Publication of the photograph was a deliberate investigative decision. Law enforcement believed that releasing his identity publicly would both generate tips about his whereabouts and would likely cause him to flee, making him easier to identify and capture. They were right, and they were wrong. Richard Ramirez, by the time his photograph was published, was in Phoenix, Arizona. He had traveled there, apparently unaware that his fingerprint had been matched, and had been visiting associates. When he saw news reports about himself on television, saw his own face staring back at him from the screen, saw that Los Angeles now knew who he was, he did what investigators anticipated. He moved. He tried to get back to Los Angeles, back to whatever refuge or anonymity the city might still offer. He arrived by bus on August 31, 1985, in the East Side neighborhood of Los Angeles. He was by then a man on the run, though he did not know precisely how close the net had been drawn. What happened next was not a police operation. It was something more chaotic, more improvised, and more distinctly American. Richard Ramirez walked into a liquor store on Hubbard Street in the East Side neighborhood of Linwood. Woman inside recognized him from the photograph that had been plastered across newspapers and television screens. She told her husband. Word spread with startling speed through the neighborhood, through the streets, from house to house, through the informal communication networks that knit together a working-class community. Ramirez, who had left the liquor store and was walking through the streets, was recognized by a group of residents. He tried to steal a car, grabbing at a woman. Through the window of her vehicle, she screamed. Her husband heard and ran out. Ramirez fled on foot. What followed was a chase through the streets of Linwood, the kind of scene that would be difficult to invent, a neighborhood mobilizing itself, men running from their yards and front porches, people pouring out of houses when they heard the commotion, all of them converging on the figure running through their streets. This man whose face they had seen on the news, had murdered and raped his way through the summer, being chased, now not by police, but by a neighborhood that had had enough. Ramirez was caught by a group of residents who beat him severely before police arrived. He was bruised and bloodied when officers finally reached him, sitting on the sidewalk, surrounded by a crowd of people who had done what months of organized law enforcement effort had failed to accomplish. An officer named Andres Ramirez, no relation, reportedly told the crowd to back away, then helped put Richard Ramirez in a patrol car. The Night Stalker was in custody. The news traveled through Los Angeles with the speed and relief of a storm breaking after a long drought. Radio stations interrupted programming. Television anchors reported it live. In neighborhoods across the city, people who had been sleeping with baseball bats beside their beds and chairs, wedged under doorknobs, allowed themselves, for the first time in months, to exhale. It was over. The terror was over. For Richard Ramirez, it was the beginning of something else. He was taken to the Linwood Sheriff's Station, where he was processed and medically treated for the injuries he had sustained during his capture. He said very little in those first hours in custody, though one statement he made was widely reported. When he was told that he was under arrest for murder, he reportedly said, "I want to die. I don't believe in the hypocrite norms of a society that has given me nothing but stupidity, poverty, and hatred. I don't need to look at any of you. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells within us all." Whether those exact words were spoken precisely as reported is difficult to verify, but they were consistent with what investigators and prosecutors would come to understand about Richard Ramirez, that he had constructed, inside himself, a complete ideological framework for what he had done, one in which he was not a criminal, but a servant of a darker spiritual power, and in which his victims were simply casualties of a war that ordinary people could not comprehend. It was, in a clinical sense, a defense mechanism. It was also, in a human sense, a profound abdication of accountability, a refusal, dressed in satanic rhetoric, to look at what he had actually done to actual people. Chapter 5. The victims. Before we follow Richard Ramirez into the courtroom, before we examine the trial and its aftermath, we must pause here. In this pause here, the middle of this narrative, and turn our full attention to the people he hurt, because any story about a killer that does not center the people who were killed, the people who survived, the families who were shattered, has failed in a fundamental moral obligation. The confirmed death toll attributed to Richard Ramirez is 13 murders. There were also numerous sexual assaults, attempted murders, and other violent crimes. The total number of survivors and their family members whose lives were permanently altered by his actions runs into the dozens, perhaps higher. Let us speak of some of them. Jenny Vinco was 79 years old when she was killed in her apartment in Glassell Park on June 28, 1984. Was the first confirmed victim. She was a grandmother. She had lived a long life, had survived her own hardships, had built a life that was modest and ordinary and dignified. Her son Jack found her body the next morning. He spent years afterward, in the painful aftermath of violent loss, carrying the weight of that discovery, the image he could never fully put away. The murder of Jenny Vinco was the act that began everything, the first domino in a sequence of destruction that would unwind over more than a year. Dale Okazaki was 34 years old when she was shot in the head in her Rosemead condominium on March 17, 1985. She worked at the Los Angeles Airport Marriott. She was young. She had her whole life in endless Airport Marriott. In front of her, her roommate, Maria Hernandez, who survived the same attack by the deflection of her keys, has spoken publicly about the decades of survivors' guilt and grief that followed, about the weight of having lived when Dale did not, about the complicated emotions of being grateful for a miracle, and devastated by what that miracle could not extend to her friend. Tsai Lian Yu was 30 years old, a traffic officer with the Monterey Park Police Department. When she was pulled from her car and shot on the same night Dale Okazaki was killed, she died 2 days later. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable courage and dedication, a person who had chosen a career in public service, who was out in the world, doing work that mattered. She deserved to come home that night. She did not. Vincent and Maxine Zazzara were married when they were murdered in Whittier on March 27, 1985. They were killed in their bedroom. in what should have been the most private and protected space imaginable. Maxine's body was mutilated after her death, an act of savagery so extreme that investigators who had seen much violence in their careers were shaken. Their son Louis Zara would spend years afterward dealing with the grief and the rage and the impossible question of why his parents had been chosen, why their home had been the one that Richard Ramirez entered that night. Harold Wu was 66 years old when he was shot and killed in his home in Monrovia on May 14, 1985. His wife Jean survived, but the assault she endured left her with physical and psychological wounds that did not heal easily or completely. She had to rebuild herself and her life in the shadow of what had been done to her and in the permanent absence of her husband. Malville Keller survived the attack on her home in Burbank. Her sister Blanche Wolfe did not. Blanche Wolfe was 83 years old. She was beaten to death in her own home, in a neighborhood where she had presumably lived safely for years, by a man she had never met and who had no reason, in any rational accounting of the world, to want her dead. Malville Keller lived with that loss, and with her own injuries, and with the knowledge that she had survived something her sister had not, for the rest of her life. Mary Louise Cannon was 75 years old when she was murdered in her home in Arcadia on July 2. Joyce Lucille Nelson was 61 when she was beaten to death in her home in Monterey Park. On July 5, Maxine Niding was 66 and Leila Niding was 64 when they were shot in their beds in Glendale on July 20. Each of these people had names, histories, families, communities. Each of their deaths left behind a specific and irreplaceable absence. Whitney Bennett, 16 years old, survived the attack on her home in Sierra Madre on July 5, 1985. She was struck with a tire iron. The weapon shorted out on an electrical wire, and the weapon shorted out on an electrical wire. Accidental intervention saved her life. She was 16 years old. She should never have been in that position. The fact that she survived was a mercy. But the experience of surviving that kind of violence, the trauma of knowing that someone entered your home and tried to kill you, does not simply resolve itself because the survivor lived. Whitney Bennett carried that night with her. Bill Carnes survived being shot 3 times in the head, though with devastating consequences. He was left with permanent brain damage, with cognitive and physical impairments that robbed him of the life he had before. August 24, 1985. He was 29 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. Inez Erickson, who survived the same attack, went on to become an advocate for crime victims, channeling her experience and her anger and her survival into something that tried to help others. But no one should have had to become that kind of advocate in that way. Peter Pan was killed in San Francisco. Barbara Pan survived, but was left with serious injuries. Their children, their community, their neighbors, all of them living with the aftermath of a night that should never have happened. And there were more than 13 deaths, more than a handful of assaults. There were attacks that did not result in death. There were survivors who have never spoken publicly. There were children who were present in homes when their parents were attacked, who saw or heard things that children should never see or hear, who grew up with those memories folded into their understanding of the world. The full human cost of what Richard Ramirez did in those months cannot be fully tallied. It spreads outward from the immediate victims in concentric rings, to family members, to neighbors, to an entire city that lived in fear, to the investigators who absorbed the horror of crime scene after crime scene and carried that weight in their own lives and their own psychology. The violence radiated outward, and its effects did not stop when the handcuffs went on. This is what it means to be the victim of a serial killer. Not just the immediate, terrible fact of the violence, but the long aftermath. Decades of living with what was done, the impossibility of ever fully returning to the person you were before. Richard Ramirez did not just commit 13 murders. He committed 13 murders and dozens of other violent crimes, and left behind a landscape of suffering that extended far beyond any individual crime scene. That is what must be kept in mind as we follow the story into the courtroom. As we watch the trial and hear the verdict, the legal process was important. Justice, whatever justice can look like in cases like this, mattered. But the legal process was never more than a partial accounting for what had actually been lost. There is one more thing worth noting about the victims of Richard Ramirez. Something that speaks to the specific character of the fear he generated in Los Angeles in 1985. His victims were diverse. They were young and old, male and female. They were white, Hispanic, Asian. They were married couples and single individuals. They lived in working-class neighborhoods and middle-class suburbs. They lived in Los Angeles proper, and in the county, and in San Francisco. Some lived alone, some lived with families. This diversity was not accidental, but it was not exactly strategic either. Ramirez chose his victims largely based on opportunity, on which houses presented accessible entry points, on which neighborhoods he found himself wandering through in a given night, on which targets presented themselves to him. As he moved through the city, he was not targeting a specific demographic. He was targeting vulnerability, accessibility, and privacy. And this is precisely what made him so terrifying. A killer who targets a specific type of victim allows potential victims who don't match that profile to feel safe. But Richard Ramirez could strike anywhere, could choose anyone. The grandmother alone in her apartment, and the young professional couple asleep in their condominium, and the elderly married couple in their Glendale home were all equally at risk. There was no profile for potential victims that could be reassuring, no set of characteristics whose absence made you safe. Everyone, in the summer of 1985, felt that they could be next. That is what collective terror feels like. That is what one person, armed with weapons and pathology, and the cover of darkness, can do to an entire metropolitan area.